Good evening. Welcome to UT Brainstorms. My name is Mike Mock. I'm a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at UT Austin. Brainstorms is sponsored by our department as our way to reach out and share with you our passion and our enthusiasm for neuroscience. We learn from you, you learn hopefully from us. And so that's why we always refer to it as a conversation, and we're going to want to have the same goal tonight. So it's exciting. This is our 36th Brainstorms. And so it's depending on how you count, it's either the last one of our 4th season or the first one of season 5. And for that, we're quite grateful. Thank you for supporting us and continuing to attend and to view Brainstorms. Thank you to those who have supported us financially. And we are committed to continuing Brainstorms until it becomes uninteresting. And so thanks again for your support. I'd like to remind you that you can go to utbrainstorms.com. There you can see the lineup, the future brainstorms. You can see links to brainstorms from the past. I think we've recorded maybe 31 or 32 of the previous 35. We didn't record the first couple, and there was a snafu one night with the videographer, but most of the previous brainstorms are there to view on our YouTube channel. And this one will be there shortly as well. So let me start my... So we have gotten into the habit on these August UT Brainstorms to follow a theme of talking about the neuroscience of learning and of teaching. And so we'll be doing that again tonight. So not only will we sharing with you our passion for neuroscience and neuroscience research, but here, in addition, our passion for teaching and quality education. As always, I want to begin by thanking Laura and Ian and Elena Silva. Laura and Elena are 2 extremely valuable members of the Department of Neuroscience, and truth be told, they do most of the work behind the scenes. They make Brainstorms happen. All of the great work that they do means that people like me can just kind of sashay in and give my presentation, and it's very easy for us to do. So thank you, as always, to Laura and Elena. So normally at this time, I introduce the speaker, which I'll do. It's me. Hello. And so, like I mentioned, we want to talk about learning and the neuroscience of learning and its implications for studying and teaching. So what kind of we might start with what kind of learning are we imagining? So when we teach, we're conveying facts, we're conveying concepts, details, connecting them, and talking about ways that facts and concepts interact to help us understand the world. But when we think then about learning, as it turns out, our learning systems are imperfect, and in fact, sort of the normal mode of our learning system is particularly bad for this task in a couple of ways. One, our normal thing is to remember the gist of things, and we're not great at remembering details and such. And then on top of that, and maybe more devastatingly, if you stop and think about it for a second, you don't remember most of what's occurred in your life. Our memory systems are designed to forget most of what we experience. And so the idea, but we do remember things, and we can, through studying and working hard, form lasting memories of facts and details and the things that make up a good education, and the things that entail becoming an expert at things. And so, as it turns out, it's not willy-nilly. The brain has rules that it implements to decide the things that we forget, the things that we just encode the gist of, and the things that we learn in detail. And so neuroscientists and cognitive scientists have learned a lot about those rules, and sort of the idea of a presentation like this is to come to understand those rules. And the idea is that when we do, That would be the basis for better learning strategies. We want to tap into the rules that tell our brain, remember this, remember it for a long time, connect it to other things. And if we're teaching, then of course this would inform better teaching practices. We want to teach in a way that encourages students to make use of these rules. And so that's really what we're about tonight, is reminding ourselves of what's known about these things. I have another passion, and this is going to be a co-theme of tonight, which is the concept of test anxiety, and sort of just the more overarching notion of students underperforming, students having a sense that they've studied hard and they've learned, but then their performance doesn't seem to bear that out. That this is the kind of thing that if you're a teacher or a professor, it can be a bit heartbreaking. You give a test, some students do well, some students don't. A student makes an appointment to come see you, and they just sort of wear their heart on the sleeve. They'll just tell you they studied so hard. They just had a sense that they knew the material so well, but then the test comes along and they just didn't do well. And so often, understandably, we imagine that the disconnect between what they thought they know and knew and what was revealed that they knew by the exam is that they must experience and suffer from test anxiety. In fact, about 32% of students in this country report experiencing some level of test anxiety, which really is just a statement that they don't do as well on tests as that they sense they should have, given the studying they did and given their sense of how well they knew the material before they went into the test. I'm going to pursue a hypothesis based on the things that we're talking about, that this disconnect is actually not so much about stress. In fact, that stress is a result of the problem. It isn't a cause of the problem. Is that the real cause of the problem is that the way that most students study is, number one, ineffective. So bad ways to study are bad because they're ineffective. But many of those bad ways have the property that they create the illusion that things are going well. And in contrast, many of the better ways to study are more difficult. And in the moment doing them, they don't give as strong a sense that things are going well. In fact, the fact that there's a struggle and it's hard work is part of why they're effective. And I think more often than not, this is the explanation for the disconnect between how well we do and how well we thought we were going to do, is that we walk in with this illusion based on bad study habits that we know more than we do. And so we're going to talk about the learning systems and the brain systems that give rise to these kinds of things. So the plan for tonight then is that I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of the different learning systems that we have. And I'm going to point out that we're going to talk about categories of them, and we're going to realize that really the point of studying and good teaching is to emphasize the useful learning systems and to avoid, in contrast, the illusion of progress that one of these learning systems provides. And in fact, we need to slant our learning towards our studying towards the kind of learning that's helpful and away from the kind of learning that gives this false sense that things are going well. And then, of course, in the end, we want to talk about the implications for these things for effective studying and better teaching practices. So that's the plan. And let's start with this guy. This is Henry Molaison. This is when he was a young man. We all knew him as HM, those of us in neuroscience, because ethics dictates that research subjects can't be identified by their names when they're still living. But when he died in 2008, we all learned his name, which was Henry Molaison. And Mr. Molaison had an unfortunate medical condition. He had severe epilepsy as a young man, probably from a bicycle accident that he had as a teenager. But in his early 20s, Mr. Molaison had terribly severe epilepsy that was not well treated by drugs. And so, like many people in that situation, surgery was a strong option. And so the idea with those surgeries is that most forms of epilepsy involve trigger zones. So there's a part of the brain that triggers the abnormal activity that spreads to many parts of the brain. And so Dr. Scoville, his surgeon, did the sorts of things that they do to determine that where Mr. Malazen's trigger zones were. As it turns out, he was an unusual case, and indeed probably the severity of his epilepsy in part derived from the fact that he had trigger zones on both sides of the brain. His trigger zones were in the medial temporal lobe near the hippocampus, which is these orange things in the deep part of the brain. And again, his trigger zones were on both sides. His surgeon informed him that he could be cured of his epilepsy, or largely cured, by removal of this, and that Dr. Scoville had done this surgery many times and reported to Mr. Malazen that he would have some memory issues, but they wouldn't be severe. Now that statement was based on his previous experience of only removing the hippocampus on one side. It turns out Dr. Scoville had never removed the hippocampus on both sides before. And after Mr. Malazen's surgery, it became immediately apparent that his memory deficits were extreme. They were so extreme then that he actually spent the rest of his life as a research subject. And the main person studying was this woman, Dr. Brenda Milner, one of the giants in our field, who studied Mr. Malazen and people like him for over 30 years. And through that work, she made many fundamental discoveries, most of which were about how we have different memory systems, that memory is not a unitary phenomenon, but we have different memory systems that are mediated by different parts of the brain that underlie different kinds of memory with different properties and different strengths and weaknesses. So to give you an idea of the kinds of experiments that she did, so first of all, Mr. Malazen, his main memory deficit is what we now call declarative memory, which is he had no capacity for stamping in new memories. So he could remember well and retrieve strongly memories from prior to his surgery, but following his surgery, he could never stamp in a new long-term memory. Now, this is often incorrectly characterized as a deficit in short-term memory. That's incorrect. Mr. Malazen's short-term memories were fine. What he lacked was the ability to stamp into his memory systems new long-term memories. So for example, Dr. Milner worked with him for over 30 years, and she reported that every day when she came in to see him, she would have to introduce herself. Good morning, my name is Dr. Milner, and I'll be working with you today. And Mr. Malazen would say, it's nice to meet you. He had no conscious memories of having ever seen her or worked with her before. Interestingly, and this is actually going to touch one of our themes tonight, he often reported that she seemed familiar in some way. So hold that thought. That's going to come up again in a bit. Let me give you an example of the kinds of experiments that she did that were surprising in the way that they revealed the different kinds of memories exist, memory systems exist in our brain. So one of the clever things that she did is that she gave Mr. Malazen this little game, a little task. This is the Tower of Hanoi game. And it consists of 3 poles and a series of rings that in decreasing size. And the object of the game is to move all the rings so that they're moved to the other side. And the rule is that you can only move a ring to one at a time to an adjacent pole. And you can never put a larger ring on top of a smaller ring. And so, for example, the first move would be to move this little one. The second move is to move it again. The third move is to move the second one over here. And there's an algorithm to do this. And because there are 7 rings, then there's a simple formula that the optimal number of moves is 2 to the number of rings. So 2 in this case, 2 to the 7th minus 1. So the optimal solution here is 127 moves. All right. So Dr. Milner discovered in doing experiments like this, this one big distinction, which is declarative memories, conscious memories, memories that we're aware of. It's really the kinds of memories that we think of when we think of memories, but we have these implicit memories, ones that sometimes are about habits and sometimes are about motor learning and sometimes just these unconscious memories. So here's an example. So she brought this game to Mr. Malaysian over the course of many weeks. Every time she introduced it to him, he reported that he had never seen or played that game before, and she had to explain the rules to him every time. So there's his absence of these declarative memories. But over a couple of weeks, he went from doing it fairly poorly to doing it every time in exactly 127 moves. So he was learning something. In fact, apparently he joked a few times that, oh, he was pretty good at this game. So he was learning, and there were memories there, but that learning for the 127 moves that he was unaware of was an implicit memory. So this is the kind of thing that she did over the years in very careful ways to show that there are different kind of memory systems with different properties. And so he would report he'd never seen the game before. That's an absence of declarative memories, but then he would do it perfectly in 127 moves. So here's the kind, and there are many ways to characterize and to categorize these memory systems, and sometimes cognitive scientists argue about the names of these things. This is the kind of I think the classic and most well accepted categorization. So there are in declarative memories, there are even different forms. So one form of declarative memory, these conscious memories, is episodic memories, memories for events. So when you remember, I remember going with my family to Niagara Falls. So that's an episodic memory. I remember when we did it. I remember being there. That's an episodic memory. A semantic memory, in contrast, is a memory for facts. So I can say things about neuroscience. I can talk about the properties of action potentials and the kinds of things that I know about neuroscience and teach them without remembering exactly when I learned those things. So those are semantic memories. So another category of declarative memories is recognition memory. And here people debate some whether recognition memory is a unitary thing or whether it can be further divided into recollection and familiarity. We're not going to concern ourselves with that here. We don't need to, but this is the kind of memory where we just have a sense that we're familiar with things, like HM or Henry Malaysian mentioning that Dr. Milner seemed familiar to him. Right? And so as it turns out, when we study, so this is a quote from a book that I'm going to reference later called Make It Stick, that most studiers focus on things like underlining and highlighting text and lecture notes and slides, and they dedicate their time to reading and becoming fluent or familiar with text and terminology because this feels like learning. This kind of studying is slanted towards recognition memory and is slanted away from semantic memory. Here's the problem. Recognition memory is fleeting. It doesn't last long. It's not terribly useful. Episodic memories, we don't really concern ourselves with in education, we don't really concern ourselves with episodic memories. We don't have to remember when we learn something. Really, education is largely about semantic memories, and semantic memories are slow, and there's a particular kind of learning and studying that helps build them. And really, because these recognition memories may give rise to this sense of familiarity that tricks us into thinking that we know something better than we do, we want to study in ways that emphasize semantic memories and really learning and de-emphasizes recognition learning. So what does that look like? And this is where cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience has taught us a great deal about what to do and the properties of these things. So first thing to appreciate is that, especially with semantic memories, we're designed to forget things. And so this is a classic study from the 1930s. And what it shows is the proportion of and questions correct on a quiz after somebody had read a story and had learned something. And this is over many days, over 9 weeks. And you can see that without any further intervention, we forget quickly. And I should mention that 25% here is random. And so this is basically forgetting completely. And this is just a reminder, it's just a scientific demonstration of the point that we are designed to forget most of what we experience. And so if we just look at something and read it a little bit and then let it go, even in just a few days, we've lost about half of it. In 5 or 6 days, we've lost most of it, and we're programmed to forget. But one of the most important concepts then, so what can we do to stop that? There must be rules to stop that. And one of the most important concepts then is that there's a particular kind of studying that puts the brakes on this process, and it's called recollection-based studying. And so this is the other groups in this same experiment, whether instead of just having them read this story and then take a test, they had them do a recollection-based form of studying where they didn't read it again, but they stopped and thought to themselves, what did I just read? They made a list, they tried to recall the things that they had just learned. So recalling things from our own memories rather than just looking at that again or being told about them again is recall-based learning or studying. And so each of these curves now shows what happened when some of the subjects then engaged in recall-based learning and they didn't forget it. And even if they did it a day later, then that seemed to arrest forgetting. In fact, wherever they were on this forgetting curve, if they took half of those subjects and had them do a recall-based learning, then it seemed to stop further forgetting. It's one of the most important concepts in what we know about memory systems and the cognitive neuroscience of learning is that recall-based studying just arrests this forgetting process. And so that's very important. It puts the brakes on this natural process. And so a study strategy based on recalling facts or concepts from memory rather than just looking at them again or reviewing by rereading is way more effective. It doesn't stamp in more learning, but what it does is that it puts the brake on this forgetting. It is the most powerful signal sent to our brain that says, don't forget this. Forget that other stuff, don't forget this. So then another really important one, and many people know about this, they just don't practice it, is the value of massed practice versus space practice. This is taken from an experiment on rats. It works in humans too. I show it because it was one of the first experiments done by a hero of mine, Michael Davis. So great inspiration to me. His beautiful work over the years is inspiration to mine, so I like showing his work. But it's a simple experiment, 2 groups of rats. They both had 10 training trials for this form of learning that Mike was studying. And this plots performance over those training trials. And the difference between the two is that the blue group got, the trials were spaced close together in time. Whereas the red group, the trials were spaced out in time. So maybe 30 seconds apart versus 5 minutes apart, just as an, actually don't remember the details, but that's the idea. And what you can see is in the moment, during the learning, if you look this, you might conclude, oh, well, this is pretty obvious. Mass practice is more effective than space practice. And in fact, in the moment, while you're doing it, that's true, right? But if you come back 24 hours later and ask about recall, it's exactly the opposite. That we tend to, even though this felt good and seemed to be doing well, we tend to forget learning more when we learned it in mass practice, and we tend to recall things better when we learned it through space practice. And I have to say that the longer out the test goes, the more this difference is exaggerated. So massed practice is bad at producing the kind of learning that recall, and spaced practice is much better. Think about it. Students love to cram. Why do they love to cram? It feels good in the moment. In fact, it is. In fact, if you need to remember something 20 minutes from now, use mass practice. But if you're studying for an exam tomorrow or next week, or a final that's going to occur at the end of the semester, or you need to learn something and not forget it because it's part of being an expert, or it's something you need to know, then mass practice is much less effective than spaced practice. So spacing is important. You should have a study strategy that uses spaced practice. Cramming is terrible. People do it because it feels good, but spaced practice is better, probably because it improves a memory process called consolidation that we won't get into, but it's important for stamping memories into long-term memory rather than something that we only hold on to for a while. There's a related trick to this called interleaving. The idea here is that if you have more than one topic to study, most of us, what we do is we study all day for topic A, and then on Saturday, we got 2 tests on Monday. So on Saturday, we spend all day studying topic A, and we spend all Sunday studying topic B. Couldn't be worse. What you want to do is study for a while at topic A, then switch to B, then back to A. You interleave the two. It's more difficult. In fact, that may be why it's better, but it's much more effective than interleaving is much more effective than doing them separately. So we could ask, why aren't we all studying this way? And I think we've already seen the hints of why that's true. If we're talking about spaced versus massed, in the moment, massed is better. So it gives us, it's more encouraging. We can tell, we get the sense that we're learning better. It's just that it's not good for the long run. And even the retrieval-based thing, when we study in a retrieval-based way, it doesn't feel as good in the moment. So here's a classic experiment. And S's here are just reading, and T's are a retrieval-based studying. And what they had 3 different groups of subjects do is the group shown by the black bars, all they did was read. So this is like students studying by just reviewing their notes over and over again 4 times. The dark gray group reviewed 3 times and then did 1 instance of retrieval-based learning. And then the light gray group looked at it once and then did 3 instances of retrieval-based learning. And 5 minutes after all of this, the more of the learning, the reading that you did and the less of the retrieval-based learning did, the better you did. Again, in the moment, seems to be better. A week later, completely the opposite. You forget almost everything that you learn. If you just look at it and review it, you retain much more a week later if you used a retrieval-based strategy. So again, just like space versus massed, doing the right kind of learning doesn't feel as good in the moment as doing the wrong kind of learning. And that's a big part of probably why we don't gravitate to these better forms of studying, is because while we're doing them, they don't feel as good and they don't seem to be working as well. So this is my hypothesis about test anxiety and that disconnect between what we thought, how well we thought we were doing, and then how we did on the test. Most of the incorrect ways to study feel better, and they may be better in the moment, and they create an illusion of being effective. But if we have to remember something tomorrow or next week or for a long time, we have to use these harder, more effort-based, retrieval-based forms of studying that don't feel as good and they don't feel as effective in the moment. They just are. And so we have to be we have to understand this, and we have to be disciplined, and we have to do the things that don't feel as good in the moment, but are more effective later. And because so many of us gravitate to these feel-good ways of studying that are ineffective, they again create this illusion. I call this the fallacy of familiarity. They create the illusion that they're better and that we're doing really well, and then we show up at the test 2 days later, and performance wasn't what we thought it would be. I really think this is the basis for most of what we call test anxiety. It's certainly the basis for most of the instances where students underperform where they thought they were, given how well things seemed to be going when they were studying. So let's talk about a roadmap to success. What kind of studying should we do? Well, I'm going to repeat the two that we've already talked about. Retrieval. Retrieval practice is better. Do not just sit and review and reread and just look at your notes. You're just becoming familiar with your notes. You're not actually stamping in strong semantic memories that you'll retain for a long time. Probably the most important message, if you remembered one thing from tonight, remember this: retrieval-based studying, retrieval-based practice, conjuring things up. Instead of reading your notes, put your notes down and try to remember from memory what's there. You may not do very well. That's a little discouraging. Then you look at it and think, oh yeah, I forgot 3 things. And then later you put them down again and you retrieve it again. Look, that's a more effortful, less encouraging way to study. The fact is, it's just way more effective. Retrieval. We have to defeat this natural tendency to forget these semantic memories by retrieval-based learning that puts the brake on it. Remember this graph. That graph is my motivation for encouraging students to use retrieval-based studying. Space versus practice, interleaving. So how much math is too much? So there's a lot of evidence to show that any studying of one topic for more than about 45 minutes or an hour, beyond that, it's relatively ineffective. So think back to the times when you were really disciplined and you sat down and you studied really hard for 3 hours on a particular topic. It's really discouraging to learn that the last 2 of those hours actually weren't terribly effective. Better way to study for about 45 minutes and take a break. So if you have 3 hours to study for an hour, take a break for an hour, study for an hour. And in those times that you're studying, use retrieval-based. That's better than studying 3 straight times. And don't forget about interleaving if you're studying more than one topic at a time. So here's some that we haven't talked about. Cognitive scientists have shown that learning is just more robust. We remember it better. We use it better when learning is effortful. So, and there's a lot of ways that we can talk about this. Learning needs to be active and effortful. Don't just read and listen, but do and recall and think and try to solve problems. When learning is hard, learning is more robust. Again, maybe it doesn't feel good in the moment, but it works better. Now, here's an important one that we can really apply. Connect what you're learning to what you already know. Use analogies. Make connections to what you learned last week in the same class. Oh, I'm starting to see how these things are fit together. That kind of learning is really effective. And I can give you kind of a hand-wavy explanation for this. So there's a lot of evidence to show that our learning, the semantic memories in particular, are based on forming associations. We connect things with other things. Okay, that's just the way learning seems to work. And so here's kind of a cartoony way to think about it. So this is a bunch of nodes in our brain that we could connect. I don't know. I don't even know what nodes are, but just, we're a little metaphorical here. So imagine I'm learning about the concept of action potential, which is a basic neuroscience concept, and I'm reading my notes, and I just know that action potential is on page 3 of my notes, and there's 3 bullet points under it, and I've read that over and over again. The reality of that is I'm forming a fairly small number of fairly weak connections, familiar connections, not semantic connections, to things. This is the kind of memory that's going to fade quickly. It's the kind of memory that it's going to be hard for me to connect to other things. It's going to be the kind of memory that's going to be difficult for me to make use of in exploring concepts and putting things together. In contrast, if I use retrieval-based memory and make it a point to try to make connections and think of analogies and think about how it connects with last week and stuff, I'm stamping in firmer memories that have connections to more nodes, if you will. This is going to be the kind of memory that's more robust, that is less apt to be forgotten, and it's going to be more useful. I'll be able to use it answering questions and putting things together and considering concepts. So analogies and connecting things to what you know, very powerful part of effective study. Another interesting one that students are not fond of, I must say, is there's all sorts of evidence to suggest that if you struggle trying to solve a problem before you're told the answer, even if the struggle was unpleasant and you made a bunch of mistakes and pursued some wrong concepts in the beginning before you were told what was right later, turns out there's something about that just clears spaces in our brain so that we make stronger connections. We learn better. We'll talk about this more when we talk about teaching. I think there's strong implications of this for teachers. So we'll cover it there. But struggling with something before you learn the answer, helpful. Real simple solution, try to figure something out before you Google the answer. You'll remember it better and learn it more robustly if you do. Even if you didn't get it, it's the process of trying that seems to be what's important. Okay, and here's two that I just have to throw in because there's a lot of neuroscience to support this, and this is not subtle. Sleep deprivation is devastating on memory systems. You need to be getting good sleep to optimize your ability to learn and remember. And there are really powerful influences of exercise. Exercise is a big one. It's true that exercise makes us healthier, and when we're healthier, we learn better. But it's even beyond that. The memory systems in our brain, many of them, like the hippocampus, the one that Henry Molaison had removed, anxiety inhibits the processing there, and exercise seems to enhance things. So exercise has the sort of triple whammy of it makes us healthier, that's good. It reduces stress, that removes a potential inhibition of processing in those memory regions, and those memory regions, processing in those memory regions is just enhanced for reasons that aren't fully understood by exercise. So if you think about the typical kid who goes off to college, they don't sleep enough, they stop exercising, they cram, they just study by rereading their notes over and again. It's like a perfect storm of bad learning. And so if you're a student, this is your roadmap for avoiding those mistakes and doing much better, frankly, for less work if you study right. So here's the list. I won't go over everything. This is what we just talked about. But if you're watching this on the YouTube video later, pause it right here and make sure that you're on top of all these things. But here's what neuroscience and cognitive science knows about learning well and getting more effective learning from less effort and less time, or less time anyway, is by learning correctly. Study smart, don't study more. And here's your roadmap right here. Right. So I'm hoping that there's some teachers and professors watching this. This is my passion for this topic. So what are the implications for people like us educators? Well, I got to start, frankly, with this one. We got to talk about PowerPoint and an over dependence on PowerPoint. I'm using PowerPoint. I know what you're thinking, guilty. But it's an over dependence on PowerPoint. It's where teaching devolves into showing PowerPoint with bulleted lists of things to memorize. Teaching in that way encourages people to learn things at very shallow levels. It encourages students to learn by just looking at the PowerPoint slides, to becoming familiar with the PowerPoint slides. It does not encourage robust learning. It doesn't encourage making connections with other things. It doesn't encourage retrieval-based learning. When we just do too much, we're just almost telling students, here, study poorly. Why do we use PowerPoint? Well, ironically, kind of for the same reasons. It's a bit of work. to learn a topic well enough that you can give an entire lecture from memory. You can retrieve it. It's a retrieval-based thing. So what do? When we build PowerPoints, we're engaging in recognition memory. We may not remember. Think of, if you're an instructor, think about how you've been in the middle of something and you're not sure what's coming next, and you do this and you think, oh, there I am, and you recognize and you go. If you're watching a lecture, you can see professors and teachers doing the same thing. In the classes that I teach every year, I try to take 1 or 2 of the PowerPoint presentations and turn them into whiteboard presentations. Can't always do it, but really the idea is get away from bullet points, get away from teaching being PowerPoints and bullet points, because that just encourages the wrong kind of learning and the wrong kind of study. So we can tap into these other things as educators as well. So if retrieval-based rather than rereading studying is better, then we can do things like save some time at the end of our lectures for summaries. So what do? We're usually rushing to get those last 2 points in. We go 30 seconds long and the bell rings and then we say, see you tomorrow. Far better if you can have the discipline to save 5 minutes at the end of every lecture. You tell your students to put all their stuff away, pull out a piece of paper and have them write down, that is, retrieve everything they can remember, all the main points that they can remember from the lecture they just heard. Okay, that's an instance of retrieval-based learning. It's an incredibly effective. It's worth about 3 hours of cramming. I'm making that number, but that's approximately the level of effectiveness. Another great one is low stakes quizzes. Quizzes, especially when they're short answer rather than true, false, or multiple choice. Again, it's a form of retrieval-based learning or studying. You have to retrieve memories to answer questions. So give a bunch of quizzes. They don't have to be worth a lot of points. In fact, it's better if they're not, because you don't want to turn this into a big anxiety thing. It's just a way of having lots of retrieval-based learning trials. Space rather than mass, practice, I don't know, maybe if you can, best to give a larger number of less involved homeworks rather than giving them one gigantic homework that and then nothing for 2 weeks. I don't know about interleaving. I don't know how that informs instructors, but this idea of connecting new material to what you know. I used to think that it was a bad habit of mine, that I would always make analogies when I was teaching. I truly thought it was something that I needed to work on and eliminate from my teaching. Turns out, by accident, it's what we should be doing. And they're not just making analogies, but when you're making a point and you're talking about concepts, if they connect to other concepts that you've talked about before, the more that you can encourage the student to see how everything fits together, making those connections to what they're learning now to what they know, it just engages a much deeper, more robust, better remembered form of learning. Making learning effortful and having this thing of trying to figure it out before you look it up. I got to say, not popular, extremely effective. You can assign difficult homeworks. You can make learning effortful. They have to do a lot of figuring out. They may fail. Now look, best to tell them what you're doing. Hey, the homeworks are difficult. That's by design. It engages the kind of learning that's real effective. Don't freak out. You're going to get points. Again, you don't want it to be stressful. I've taken to do this in my classes. I give these homeworks that are these virtual experiments, and they're kind of open-ended, and the students hate them. I get students sort of glaring at me when they're turning them in. I've had students say, well, I got nothing out of that, as they slammed the piece of paper down on the desk before class. Many of them came back to me later and said, you know, I hated those homeworks, but God, they really were effective. Thank you. So you're not going to win any popularity contests, but having the challenging students, making homeworks difficult, making learning effortful, and having them try to figure out and even fail in trying to figure out before you tell them how it works is just better than telling them in the beginning how it works. So there are some thoughts about how these things connect with good teaching practices as well. And so I want to end by just mentioning that there are a lot of great books on this topic. I just happen to really like this one. For one thing, the three authors are researchers in this field. They've done many of the experiments that have gone in to the sorts of things that we're talking about tonight. It's really clearly written. It's written for students. It's written for teachers. If you're intrigued by what I'm talking about, find a copy of this book. It's really helped my teaching immensely. Okay? And so with that, then the idea then is that if we do this right, then students can learn things like this and remember it for a long time, and probably put less hours in studying that they can do. So what's he doing wrong here? Well, he showed the whole answer without the students having to struggle. But anyway, that's the end of what I have to say. And so we're going to transition into the phase now where we're happy to answer your questions. And I'm, in doing this, going to invite my panelist tonight, Dr. Kristin Patterson, who's turning on her camera here in a second as I'm about to turn off the PowerPoint. We love having Kristin do this. She's a really talented teacher here at UT. She's a professor of instruction at UT. She's a consultant for TIDES, which is a really valuable resource at UT to helping us learn how to teach better. She's been a great friend of the Department of Neuroscience. She's helped us redesign our curriculum and stuff, but mostly she just has a great passion for this topic, and she's a really, really talented teacher. And so, Kristin, thank you. I know you're really busy at the beginning of the semester, but thanks so much for being the panelist tonight. So thank you for that.
Hi, everyone.
So, feel free to just be typing in your questions in the YouTube chat. They get transferred to our little chat here, and then I'm going to read them, and then Kristin and I are going to do our best to answer them. So are you ready, Kristin?
Sure.
Okay, so first question's from a longtime Brainstorms participant, Joe Virgil. If a person is studying from an essay, are there differences in remembering when reading versus listening to an audible recorded version?
Do you know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect just on first principles that effortful learning is better. I think listening is probably less effective than reading. Whatever you do, whether you read it or you listen to it, when it's done, if you stopped for a second and tried to recall what you had just heard or recall what you just listened to, it probably doesn't matter whether it's, I suspect it doesn't matter whether it's auditory or reading. Does that sound sensible to you?
Yeah, I think whether you're reading or listening, both of those are kind of passive.
Yeah.
And you could do other things to make them more active, like pausing and writing down some summary, like a summary of what you just read, or answering a few questions here and there. The other thing I might say is that it's possible that for different people, one or the other of those modes of taking in information might be better.
Yeah.
Like if someone maybe has trouble seeing, it might be better for them to listen. And so the answer might not be the same for all people.
So I agree. One of the things that I suggest to my students do is that practice, if you've learned something, practice explaining it to somebody else, which is really a form of retrieval studying. So for example, I'm imagining this question comes from, I like to listen to podcasts. And so is that effective or not? So you're listening to a podcast and you stop it, you could try, if you're in the car, you could pretend like you're talking to someone, pretend like you're explaining what you just heard to somebody else. It's a particularly effective way of stamping in whatever it is that you just heard or just read. You see a question?
Depend on, I mean, it might also depend on, like you mentioned, listening to a podcast in the car, right? And so
that my wife listens to a lot of podcasts in the car, so that's what I think of when I think of podcasts.
And I think a lot of people probably do, and then you may not be putting your full attention.
Right. So when you get home and you're not driving anymore, you should say, "What did I just hear?" And that would be a form of retrieval that's maybe a little more consistent with good driving, for example.
Yeah, and actually that relates to another question
Yeah, you go.
that we have already about, would it be helpful to have a conversation with other people who are learning the same things? And, the simple answer is, of course, yes, that's great. That's also another example of retrieval practice where you're explaining with other people. And I would even argue that even if you don't have somebody else to explain to, you could explain to yourself.
Right.
You could just talk to yourself or look in the mirror or whatever. But yes, having a conversation and reviewing the material without looking it up.
Yeah.
But and that's, I think, the important part is that you're not looking it up.
Right.
And if you are talking to some other people, they may be able to point out and ask questions and help you add some detail over time, like get you to question your understanding, because I think part of this is like getting a sense of whether you really understand, like what do you understand and what you don't not understand, and then spend your time on the things that you don't understand.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't have enjoyed studying this way back when I was a student, but there is a certain power in having a study partner or a small study group. So first of all, you're using retrieval practice to you ask each other questions or you explain things to each other. You're using retrieval. The group can then identify, oh wait, you forgot this, or you said that wrong. So as a group, you can identify what's missing. You can even listen to people and say, oh wow, I loved your explanation better than mine. And so next time I do it, I'm going to try to, so it's a way of doing retrieval, identifying holes that should be the focus of future studying. And I think there's a real power in explaining things. I think teachers learn things fairly deeply because we explain them, and there's a real effective memory aspect of explaining something. You don't really know something until you can explain it to somebody else. That's one way to think of it, right? You see another question there, Kristin, that you enjoyed talking about?
Give me a minute. You pick one first, and I'll read some.
This one caught my eye. So how does anxiety, depression, and/or sleeping pills affect memory?
Again, you are probably a better person to answer that question.
Well, I don't know about depression's just bad all around, and I don't know anything about sleeping pills, but I do know that anxiety is particularly devastating. It's kind of the plus and minus of like grades and exams, because we really want people to learn. But when we give there's a lot of pressure and stress that goes into exams. Students can just be anxious these days in general. And there's all sorts of neuroscience evidence that shows that anxiety is just a buzzkill on learning and memory. And so that's the power, for example, of a part of the power of exercise. And I don't know anything about sleeping pills and things. Sounds bad. I'm going to just guess that it sounds bad.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the sleeping pill part of that question either. And I was going to suggest, if you imagine what you're proposing is that people choose learning strategies that are effortful.
Yes.
And that leads to better memory. And if you are experiencing depression, it seems like it would be even more difficult to engage in an effortful thing.
Right. So you might go towards the easy stuff. Yeah.
Right. So you might, or not do it at all.
So speaking of effortful, when I was talking, I was actually having trouble in the moment conjuring up some examples of effortful versus, I know this is one of your passions. So can you talk a little bit about learning strategies that emphasize the effort part?
Well, I think that, yeah, sure. So one example that I think you already gave is the idea of rereading your notes. That is a low effort thing and gives you a very false sense of security because you're constantly looking at something that's becoming more and more familiar. And when things are familiar, you think, oh, great, I know it.
Yeah.
And however, you could do things to make using your notes more effortful. Like you could look at your notes and see if there's a concept on one page that relates to a concept on another page and move them, like rewrite them or copy and paste if it's electronic notes so that they are together and you're making a connection between those things. And so again, that's something that where you're doing something active, right? You're not just rereading, you're making connections between different concepts.
Isn't it funny? I know you have more to say, but isn't it funny that the two most common things in teaching, which is lecturing and having students listen and rereading notes from those lectures, are two of the most ineffective ways of teaching and learning and studying? It's a little sad in a way.
Yeah, well, and that relates to the comments about PowerPoints, I think. And I don't think it's necessarily true that PowerPoint is a bad tool. It's often used badly. But, you know, PowerPoint can be a way of organizing and presenting things that you want. Like you could have on a PowerPoint slide, instead of a bulleted list of words, you could have a diagram or a graph. And then you can ask your students to work with that information. It's still using a PowerPoint,
right?
But what you're asking the students to do is totally different.
Right.
And I think what happens when an instructor makes a PowerPoint or puts together the order of a lecture is that the instructor is learning a ton, right? They're doing the effortful part of figuring out what's important, what's not important, what the order should be, what things are related to what the examples are, and what the big concepts are. Mm-hmm. And so the instructor learns a lot, and it feels to the instructor like this is a really great thing. And the students who are sitting passively listening to that final product have not benefited from the process that went into making that lecture.
Yeah. So listening to you talk, it's almost like it would be better if you made a video of yourself putting the lecture together. The students could watch you making the connections and so wait, this really, in an odd sort of way, that would be even more effective.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that instructors could do to help students learn is model behaviors, like model expert behaviors. And it could be about modeling whatever you have to learn to put together a lecture. It could also be modeling the process that you took to solve a problem.
Yeah.
How did you answer a question?
Yeah.
Like, how would you explain that to someone else?
I really think teaching, and so that's a really important part of teaching in science, because you and I have talked about this, but science is a process for finding answers. But too often when we teach science, we don't teach the process, we just tell people the answers.
Yeah.
And really, even if we just want them to remember the answers, teaching it by talking about how the answer was discovered and all the work that went into it is probably a more effective way to teach it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a funny thing about teaching science. I notice here, somebody asked, could we please explain spaced learning a little better? So
I think the idea of spacing, and I think people ask the question, like, what does a space mean? What is the best unit of space? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I would describe it as the spacing you're learning or studying is sort of the opposite of cramming.
Yeah.
First of all. And so that means instead of, like, a lot of students who maybe didn't perform as well as they wanted to on an exam might come in and ask, I don't understand it. I didn't do as well as I wanted to, and I studied all weekend. And yes, that's a lot of time to study, but it was all in one clump.
Right.
And so if you took all those hours that you spent studying on one weekend and spread them out over the 4 weeks or whatever amount of weeks of material was on that exam, then that's what we mean by spacing. So take 30 minutes every day and study that topic instead of not studying at all and then studying for 16 hours in one weekend.
Yeah, and in fact, unfortunately, this is part of the problem, is that it takes discipline to not leave it till the end. It takes discipline to study a little bit every night instead of just letting it go and then studying like crazy the weekend before the exam. But there's also another way to talk about spacing is if you're studying one topic, the evidence is that beyond about 45 minutes, you hit a pretty strong amount of diminishing return. So every 10 minutes more that you spend, you're not getting 10 minutes worth of improvement. So another way to think about spacing is study for 45 minutes, take a break, and then study it 45 minutes again later, and instead of studying for 3 hours nonstop.
Yeah, and that's again also related to that concept of interleaving, where instead of studying like topic A and topic A and topic A like over and over again, you can study topic A and topic B and topic C, keep switching.
Right.
And then if you do that pattern again, instead of doing it in the same order, like change the order.
Oh.
Constantly doing something different.
Yeah,
right. And again, it is going to feel hard because you're trying to avoid giving yourself that sense of security, that sense of familiarity.
Right. Because you keep your brain has to keep switching to the new thing. And
right. Right. And I've also heard this described as and this might be helpful for people who want to know like how long you should wait in between studying and then studying again, is that what you want to happen is you want to almost forget the thing and like forget it a little bit. Yeah. And then if you forget it a little bit, it becomes more difficult to retrieve it. And that's what you're trying to do, is make it difficult.
I like to tell students, I get the same question. They want a really concrete formula. So I say, you've got a test on Monday. Now, first of all, I hope you've been studying a little bit every night, right? But let's say that you have a total of 4 hours to devote to this class studying. You've got other things to do and blah, blah, blah. So don't study from 8 o'clock to midnight the night before the exam. That's the worst of all possibilities. Study for 45 minutes, take a break, get some exercise, come back later after, take a nap, right? Come back later after that, study for another, just keep doing these little 45-minute segments, but spread them out in time, do things in between, do other things in between. And if it's exercise, it's even better.
There is a question about how much exercise is the right amount. And again, I'm not an expert in exercise, but I've heard that even 5 minutes of exercise is better than none, right?
Yeah, agreed. Literally taking a walk is better than nothing, right? So instead of studying for 3 hours straight, study for an hour, take a walk for an hour, and then study for an hour again. Each of them was 3 hours. The second was more pleasant than the first one. The second one was more effective than the first one. So yeah, it's one of, I always tell people, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. But in this case, it's not. If you study smart, it's that you actually spend less total time doing it. It's more effort while you're doing it. But if time is your limited resource, then there you go. So you see another good question?
There's actually a lot of good questions. I don't know the answer, but I'm interested in, several people have asked about how age impacts memory and retrieval.
I don't want to talk about this one. So here's the thing. Here's the thing. It does. It's hard. It's harder to learn things as you get older. There's just no way around that. Some of that, but all of these principles, like whatever your upper limit is, you'll achieve that upper limit better with the same principles. So that's just a blanket thing to say. The other thing to say, many of our early brainstorms were about like how do I do better as I age? And one of the things that we harped on was sleep. As people get older, they often find it more difficult to sleep. And we know that sleep interferes with learning. And some people did some calculations and showed us that if you look at the average sleep problem that old people have, and you subtract the influence that must have had on learning, then people's decline in memory is actually pretty low as they age. So a big part of it is sleep. We tend to exercise less as we get older. So I think that the people want to know, what pill should I take, or what, should I, we used to harp in many of the early brainstorms that the 2 secrets to retaining your memory as best you can as you get older is sleep and exercise. 2 of the same things that we tell the younger people to do as well.
Plus, then you just feel better overall.
There's that bonus too. Right. So what's to not like about that, right? And we're not talking about running a marathon. We're talking about taking a walk even. So, yeah.
Here's an interesting question from Timothy Smith about if more effective study techniques lead to a sense of non-progress, how can we know if we've sufficiently studied for an exam? So the worry is that you would always feel unprepared. Yeah. And so I think part of the challenge here is that assumption that you're wanting to learn things and remember things because of an exam. And so if you can overcome that sort of bias that the only reason that you're learning something is to take an exam that's like 3 weeks later, and that you're actually wanting to learn things because your whole years of education are going to depend on learning the earlier things. And maybe your career will depend on having learned those things in college and being able to build on that knowledge continuously. Then it becomes less about feeling prepared for an exam and more about seeing over time that you are really becoming much more competent. Right. I know everyone who's a student is saying, but I've got to do.
Yes, they are. So what's interesting, another plug for that book, Make It Stick, the authors actually address this very point in that book, that that students will complain that if they study this way, it's a little harder. And their answer, harder to know when to stop, their answer is that in one mode, you know that you're being lied to, that however good it feels, it's not that good. In the other mode, you might have a little self-doubt, but it's actually more effective. And they really just harp on trusting it, that if you can sit and recall things, and in the beginning, when you started studying using this retrieval-based technique, you would only remember a third of the stuff and have to look up the other 2. And then now I get it. I can retrieve almost everything every time, even though it's kind of hard. And once in a while, I forget one of the 7 things or whatever it is. That's just a sign. If you're doing it by retrieval, then you're getting it down. But they admit that this is one of the problems, is that the ineffective study strategies feel better when you're doing them. They just do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's that thing about so the question says they think you would feel eternally unprepared. And so then you have to decide between feeling unprepared and actually being unprepared.
Right. So I remember a comment of one of my, so I harp on these things now at the beginning of the classes that I teach. And I had a student report to me, now that it just occurred to me, something like this. And what she said is that her solution to that is she just started doing better on the exams. And it was just that she just knew it was effective. Mm-hmm. didn't matter how she felt. She just knew that she gained this confidence that I know I'm going to do well on the exam because I'm studying correctly. And so maybe you have to have focus on a different way of self-evaluation, not like how does it feel, but the self-evaluation is I know I'm using the right right strategies, and I know that it's going to work.
Yeah, that's true. You have to have a system by which you assess how you're doing.
Well, one great way is to study with a partner, and when you guys can't stump each other anymore, that's a pretty good sign, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. There's a question here about how is learning impacted by your environment? So like if you're studying in one place, should you move to another place? I don't know.
Well, there is an old literature on state-dependent learning that says if you retrieve a memory in the same context that you learned it, that you'll do a little better. And that gave rise to this fad in the 70s and 80s that people would literally go study in the room where the test was going to be given. The Make It Stick authors point out that this is a bit of a fallacy. It's actually you're going to produce better, longer lasting, more robust learning if you study in different places. It's more effortful to study here for a while and then study over here where you lose some of those context cues and study over here, and that maybe it's best not to have one particular place that you study, or certainly not best to just go study in the lecture hall. But in the end, I think that my sense is that the size of those effects are pretty small compared to the beneficial size of the effects of doing things like retrieval learning and spaced learning and effortful learning, the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. I know there's a lot of good questions, but so teacher to teacher. So tell me a couple of things that you do where you're taking these ideas and importing them into the classroom and into the way that you teach. Because I know you're really good at this. I want to hear some of the things that you say.
One of the things that you mentioned in your talk was about stopping the class a couple minutes early and asking the students to recall what they learned, or what they heard in the last hour or whatever. And I think that's a really great idea. And I think I would do it more frequently than that. And so one thing is, since we've all for the last year been teaching online, and what I did with my class was I took all of my classes and rearranged all my PowerPoints, because I do have PowerPoints, into just a few slides and recorded them all. And so to have videos of like each topic in very short videos. And so the idea then is, like, after every 5-minute video, you could, or whether it's a lecture or a video, you could have students just recall, like, what are 3 things that were meaningful to you that you just heard in the last 5 minutes, and write them down. What do you have questions about? Like, what did you already know? Or what does this relate to in your life? And so I think that asking students questions fairly frequently throughout a learning session is a really good way of just making yourself stop, allowing them to use that retrieval practice retrieval. And then if they and you, if this is visible, get a sense of what the problem points are. Like if they all say, oh, that all made sense except for this one thing, then you know that maybe you need to review that. for, after that for 30 seconds or something like that, come back to it and answer their questions.
It's almost like you're turning the class into that study group concept that I was talking about, where you say something and then everybody goes, oh, wait, you missed one. And then we know to focus on the one that got missed and things like
Yeah.
that.
I think it's important and takes some confidence for an instructor to not think that they know everything, and like to not set up
What?
that
You don't know everything?
That vibe. to not set up that structure in your classroom where the instructor knows everything and the students are learning everything, and instead to make it more of a back and forth. And because in that room, there's a lot of experience and different, different connections could be made by different people. And
people would come up with different analogies for the same thing. Yeah, good one. That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why I really like to get students talking in class.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of pressure off of me. So if you're a person who really doesn't like to be the center of attention all the time, then asking students to talk and answer questions and discuss with each other is a really good way to get them to do that really excellent study strategy and learning in class without like all the eyes just always being on you.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's not about the teacher. That's right. Yeah. So one of my versions of that is that when I'm leading up to some big neuroscience concept, and I'll set the stage of what was known, and then when the classic experiment was done to discover that, and I'll ask the class, what experiment would you have done under these circumstances? And sometimes they come up with the very experiment. These students are brilliant, right? And sometimes they come up with terrible things, but I've done that for a long time, but it occurred to me just a little while ago that, again, kind of by accident, that was an example of asking them to try to figure it, struggle with it before you tell them what the answer is, and that they learn it better. First of all, they get a kick out of when they figure it out. That makes them feel good. I used to award Nobel Prizes in my class when students like just completely hit the right. But it's an example of them struggling with it. Instead of just telling them the answer, they struggle with it, and then you tell them the answer, and they just remember it better and learn it more robustly. So.
Yeah, and then often if they're talking to each other, they might figure the answer out.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Without you telling them.
Yeah, which is just, there's a big confidence boost for that as well. Right.
Yeah. Another thing I really like to do is anything that I can do to help students make connections. And one idea for doing that is to do something that's called concept maps. And so a concept map is basically a diagram. And so this is the other thing, like learning can also be helped if you don't use just one mode, like only text or only diagrams. You can use text and diagrams. And a concept map is a visualization of connections that uses like boxes with words in them. That's a concept connected to other boxes through arrows. And then you label the arrows to tell what the connection is. And you can keep on making those connections and keep adding concepts until your map is quite complex. And so as you're going along, you can build more complexity and more detail and whatnot in your understanding.
So you would actually kind of build it as the class goes on. It becomes more elaborate as the class goes on.
Yeah, in fact, I think most students need to learn how to make those. And so they start out very, very simple.
Sure.
In fact, I've had to do them sometimes. I've been asked to do them in some workshops and been given, say, 10 words and been told, make a concept map with this. And it's very difficult to do.
That sounds
Speaking of making things effortful.
Yeah, that sounds hard. So a much lower tech version of the same trick is that it's often good to begin every lecture with a brief summary of what the previous lecture was, particularly if if it facilitates making connections with what you're talking about today, as it connects to so that's almost like a verbal connection map. But
Mhm.
I don't do these connection maps. I need to think about it. It sounds difficult, but effective. So
There's definitely a learning curve.
yeah,
It's
sounds
hard. It's hard, but it gets easier as you do it.
so there's a question about what is the minimum hours of sleep. Asking for a friend. I put that part in. What are the minimum hours of sleep a college student should get? So it's more than most of them get, that's for sure.
Absolutely. It's something like 9,
Yeah,
8
no,
or 9 hours for that age group.
there are some great books written by sleep researchers that talk about this, and their numbers are always like bigger than we think about, 9 to 10 hours or something. And yeah, but stay up till 3 in the morning and cramming and then get 3 hours of sleep is way not the right answer. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So
There was an interesting question that you might not want to answer, but we could chat for a minute about how you would have done your talk tonight if you didn't have slides. Would that have been possible?
well, it's funny. I thought of this. I always get a chuckle with myself about I'm harshing on PowerPoint with my 33rd PowerPoint slide of the present. So I get that, but yeah, I don't know, in situations. So I find PowerPoint useful when I want to show diagrams that are more complicated than I'm good at drawing. I use PowerPoint sometimes. I try to stay away from bullet points, but some of tonight was just like listing some concepts. And so, but I find throwing away a PowerPoint particularly easy and useful when I'm just talking about concepts, the ones that I can draw myself. And one of the value is that it just slows me down. So for example, one answer to that question would be, if I had done that, I would have talked about fewer things. And just to critique myself here, that probably would have been a better presentation. Because one of the things that cognitive psychologists talk about a lot is that in any given hour lecture, you've got 3 concepts. You're going to get across 3 concepts, a maximum of 3 concepts. So if I had to do it by hand, I have a webcam, so I could have, like, the mechanics of it is that I could have had the camera pointed at a piece of paper, or document cam, I could have had the camera pointed at a piece of paper and I could have been drawing. And I could have written out those things. And the value of it is that I would have been forced, because I'm writing it out and drawing it myself, I would have been forced to make decisions about talking about fewer things, or maybe saying fewer words about everything. It's hard, but the idea is that we say too many words when we lecture anyway. We usually present too many concepts per lecture than is really useful. So one answer to the question is that it would have been simpler. I would have mentioned fewer details. And again, just to critique myself, it probably would have been a more effective presentation. That would have been much more difficult for me to implement.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the yin and yang of it. So
yeah, I feel very fortunate that I have an iPad with an Apple Pencil.
mm-hmm.
And it doesn't have to be an Apple product. You can have tablets that are from other companies, but it's really fun to draw, like, because then you can connect that to your computer instead of presenting slides. It could be a blank canvas that
Right.
you can then draw on and switch colors. And the technologies, some technologies allow you to, like, essentially look like you're writing. It's not like using your finger or a trackpad or anything like that. Like, it's essentially your own handwriting, and that can be really fun to do. And then sometimes students do that too. If they have tablets and they come to office hours or something, they may use that technology as well to
Right.
express their questions.
As you well know, like, everybody seems to have one these days.
Yeah.
I just favor a lower tech thing. Again, I bought a little document camera. So basically I have one camera pointed at me and one camera pointed at a piece of paper. And then my blank slate is a blank piece of paper. I'm old, so I just favor that better. But not coincidentally, by the way, tablet computers were in terribly short supply once remote learning started.
Mhm.
Everybody was trying to buy them and everybody ran out of them. So yeah, they are particularly effective. Kristin, we got time for one more question. Would you pick it?
Oh yeah, I totally want to know the answer to this too. Are there any updates to the cell phone study? Remember last time you talked about that cell phone study where that showed that you didn't learn as much or your test scores went down when your cell phone was even nearby you?
Right. That was last August's. That was the brainstorms I did last August, and I folded in more about distraction, and it was the answer is I don't know. I just enjoy talking about that because it was done here at UT, among other things. But that would be a great. I don't know the answer. It would be a great thing to Google, but I don't think anybody has backed down from the idea that distraction is bad.
Yeah, and that relates to another quick question, which is about the Pomodoro technique. Have you heard of Pomodoro?
I don't know that. You go.
Okay, so Pomodoro is a way of managing your time that's supposed to reduce distraction. And it's, I don't know the details, but you basically like work for 20 minutes and then take a break for 5 minutes and then work for 20 minutes and then take a break for 5 minutes. And the idea is anyone can focus for 20 minutes. And if they know that they're going to have a time to be distracted, after that 20 minutes. I thought about trying it one time and I just can't work that way. So I haven't done it.
No.
But I know
I'm not that disciplined, but I have found that at my age, my attention span has gone down a tad. And the deal that I make with myself is I do something like that. I try to work for about 45 minutes and then I treat myself to like a brief walk or a Coke or something. And so there is this kind of effectiveness of being almost like a behaviorist and saying, Mike, if you really focus on this for a half hour, you can have a Coke. And there's a lot of evidence that behavioral approaches like that are effective. And there's no question that it would tap into this spacing thing that we lose effectiveness beyond certain fairly short periods of time, and so why not just chop up the day into smaller pieces? So
yeah,
would be something to look up. So well, we're out of time, and so I want to say thanks to you, Kristin, and thanks to the audience. And I just feel like you should be the panelist for every Brainstorms. It's always so good. So I just want to say thanks, and particularly if we're talking about learning or teaching. So thank you so much. Like I said, I know you're crazy busy right now because you're teaching up a storm. So thanks. And I hope everybody enjoyed it. And thanks for the people who participated. Thanks for the questions. Maybe we can talk you, when you're a little less busy, maybe we can talk you into doing another Brainstorms where you're the presenter and I'll be the panelist or something like that. But thanks much. I think it was great. And so just as a goodbye then, thanks to everybody, and go to utbrainstorms.com to see what's coming. We've got a whole fall lineup of topics. We're hoping to be in person again someday. One advantage of this YouTube format is that they go straight to YouTube, so it doesn't take very long before, if you missed it or want to see it again, you can just go to our YouTube channel and click on it and see it again. So Kristin, thank you so much. Good luck on your teaching this semester. And
thank you, same to you, Mike. And I also want to thank everyone for their questions. They were really good.
They were good. Yeah. So, okay. Anyway, thanks much. See y'all next time. Thank you, Kristin, and hope you guys have a great semester.
Thank you. I hope you do too.
Bye.